Oh, boy.
Okay. Oh, this is going to be interesting.
Yeah.
Because, okay, I did not print out my notes.
Ooh.
Wait a minute. Maybe I did.
Go get it? You can go get
Maybe
them.
I did. Hang on. I'm going to do this because I think I did. I thought I did. Okay. Did I? Yes, I did. Okay. Normally I would try to wing it, but I have quotes. And I
Ooh.
can't do the
We don't
quotes.
want to wing quotes.
So, gotta get the quotes right. Okay. Yeah, memory brain of Joanne Freeman has a kind of I know I would have winged it. And actually many people, Peter Onuf has been wanting me to riff, to improvise ever since I've known him for like 40 years. And I'm always like, Peter, if it's not broke, don't fix it. Like anyway, you'll see
what crazy that you guys ran to each other on the train. You really didn't know he was going to be on that train?
No.
So random. Everybody loved the picture.
I was sitting next to Heather and Heather said, is that Peter Onuf? I turned around. Anyway, we can talk about this after.
Okay.
Most importantly, welcome to History Matters. And so does coffee. And I now have my notes and we're going to settle in. I'm going to once again close chat so that I can focus on you guys. Today, we're going to talk about corruption. It's a topic that has been coming and going. There was some other week I know where I said, that's what I'm going to talk about. And then as ever, something happened in the news and I was like, not corruption this week, but corruption this week. I want to talk about it. It kind of just feels like it's been building as a subject. But before I plunge into that, I want to turn to my partner in crime, Annie, who will explain the rules of the game.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Annie Evans from New American History, and I'm delighted to be with you all every Friday. We have a very fun group already exchanging messages in the chat if you're with us on Zoom. And I think those of you joining us on Facebook probably are doing the same. But we hope that you will add some questions as you're listening to Joanne's talk this morning. So Joanne will talk for about a half an hour. While she's doing that, if you jot your questions down below in the Q&A, then in about 30 minutes, I'll come back and we will get ready to answer your questions. So we'll see you in a little bit.
Excellent. And I will add to that, this community here at History Matters has been going strong for almost 3 years, more than 3 years. Time has collapsed since the pandemic started, but at any rate, I think 3 years. Episode 164. So 164 straight episodes, folks. And I say that because if you are new here, if you're beaming in for the first time, please tell us, put it in chat, make sure that you're chatting to everyone, because the community will give you a robust welcome. It really over the years has become a true community and has been meeting here solidly 165 weeks, which we need communities of one kind or another. I'll come back to that at the end, which I always do, but particularly now, politically and socially, communities are a good thing. Okay, so the topic, as I just suggested, is corruption. And I mean political corruption in politics. There are several definitions of corruption that I'm going to bounce around at you today. And I want to say along the lines of that, one of the distinctive things about corruption, there are some things that are obviously corrupt and others that are not, but there's a big middle ground. It's fluid, the idea of what corruption is. It shifts a little over time. There are things that are just wrong, so don't get me wrong. There are things that are just corrupt, malfeasance, bad, bribery, all kinds of things that equal corruption. But as you'll hear today, at different times, people have defined corruption in different ways and thought about it and considered its benefits, if there are some, which, as I said in my tweet yesterday, Alexander Hamilton thought there were some, how that has changed over time. So generally speaking, corruption is defined as the abuse, in the way I'm using it today, political corruption, as the abuse of public power, especially for private gain, which is a pretty straightforward definition. and also very broad and also very amorphous in some ways. So it is fluid. I've said before, and I'll probably loop around back to it at the end, one of the reasons why I think hearings, public hearings are important, but any hearings are important when seemingly a line has been crossed. Part of the importance of that, regardless of whether there is a concrete outcome, is that the hearing itself is a statement that there is a line that seemingly has been crossed. It's a declaration that something has happened that some people see as corrupt. So that simple fact is significant in and of itself. Hearings, the fact that they are happening and that someone has said this is corrupt, at least it brings our attention to think about to think about what we consider right or wrong in different circumstances. So as fluid as it is, it's important to take note of it. I'll also loop back to that at the end. We've seen a lot of talk, certainly over the weeks when I thought I would talk about this, and now I'm not. There seem to be ever more questions of corruption or ethics floating around in current affairs, in the news. I'm not going to go into detail about them, but obviously Clarence Thomas, George Santos, all of these, a variety of different big name people, and questions about ethics and or corruption and perhaps morality and politics and public servants and tenure. I almost was going to talk about tenure today, and I stopped because it was too bound up in what I do. But the larger point I wanted to make was that tenure is very important, but that it also can mask big problems. So the pros and cons of tenure is what I was going to talk about, thinking of the Supreme Court, as well as thinking about college professors. And I might do that another week. However, for now, corruption. One other point I'll raise, and I'll come back to it at the end too, regarding corruption, and it's an interesting one to me, is the question of norms. I've talked about this, I know, a number of times before, the ways in which recent years have seen a collapse of many things that we've long considered to be norms. And one of the things that we've discovered over time, not because it's new, but because I think one of the things about norms is that they're so normal that you don't necessarily think about them until they're violated. Norms are a sort of general assumed upon thing. As we've learned, as they've been overturned in one way or another in recent years, they're not necessarily legislated. There's nothing necessarily in writing about them. It's just a sort of general understanding that this is the way things have always proceeded, which you obviously, for obvious reasons, don't necessarily think about until someone violates it, doesn't do it, or does something exceeding explicitly against a norm. And then suddenly you say, wait, can he or she do that? Really? And then you realize, yeah, they can, because there's no legislation about it. They just violated a norm. So we've seen so much of that happening in the recent past that I think that also is helping to contribute to our current ethics and corruption centered political moment. Now, on Twitter, I did mention the fact that Alexander Hamilton praised corruption, and this is why I had to go and get my notes, because it's a Hamilton quote, and actually it's a Jefferson quote of a Hamilton quote, which is significant. But I wanted to be able to give it to you and then give you the definition of corruption that he was working from. In the 18th century, I suppose you could say the late 18th century, the early 19th century, corruption, certainly as Hamilton and David Hume, political thinker, conceived of it, really was influence. And that word has many shadings, right? Political influence, you have influence, you give influence, influence can get you things that can easily be corrupt, but you can also see how it is kind of factored in, if not embedded in the process of politics, or certainly that's what Hamilton suggested. So supposedly at a dinner party, Thomas Jefferson did a very good job, seemingly, of writing down what people said at his dinner parties and then saving them and putting them, organizing them in his notes of what happened during his time as Secretary of State, after, when he was long retired. So at the age of 75 in 1818, he's writing this sort of autobiographical statement to preface his selection of letters and memos and gossip that he's going to leave in his papers for after he dies for those to find, which is his account of his time as Secretary of State. And he tells a story about Hamilton at a dinner party, along with Vice President John Adams and Secretary of War Henry Knox. Now, Jefferson has this habit when he wants to really emphasize that Hamilton said something really problematic. Jefferson always inserts a pause before Hamilton speaks. And this is one example of that. Okay. So this is now Jefferson's words. When dinner was over and the cloth was removed, the conversation strayed into the subject of the British Constitution. As Jefferson recalled it, Adams said, "Purge that Constitution of its corruption and give to its popular branch equality of representation, and it would be the most perfect Constitution ever devised by the wit of man." At this point, Hamilton paused, which means, uh-oh, he's going to say something shocking. And Hamilton said, according to Jefferson, "Purge it of its corruption and give to its popular branch equality of representation, and it would become an impracticable government. As it stands at present, with all its supposed defects, it is the most perfect government that ever existed." Now, the reason why Jefferson inserted the dramatic pause there to focus your attention on what Hamilton was saying is that to Jefferson, that was the key to Hamilton's politics. Jefferson wrote in that preface at another point, Hamilton was not only a monarchist, but for a monarchy bottomed on corruption. And it was Hamilton's corruption that was a particular focus, as Jefferson defined it. That's an important point I'll come back to. That was a focus of Jefferson's dislike of Hamilton, one focus of many focuses of his dislike of Hamilton. As he put it in 1792, actually sort of tattling to George Washington, Hamilton had at his disposal, quote, "a squadron devoted to the nod of the Treasury," meaning Hamilton was influencing Congress, personally influencing Congress, having private meetings and doing things with Congress, who was devoted, this group, to his nod, and as Jefferson put it, out of the public eye and able to serve their own interests. Such men would form the most corrupt government on earth. Drama. Okay. Now, it's interesting for me to, I remembered in planning this episode that I had once given, and not more than once actually, a lecture on Hamilton and corruption, but it was many, many, many years ago. And what I wrote in my notes here, this is from a lecture that I gave when the Hamilton is evil theory prevailed, right? There was a long period of time when Hamilton was just a corrupt, scheming guy and nothing else. So this is pre-Hamilton musical. My interest in this dates back earlier. What's significant to note here is that Hamilton didn't make up that idea. He took it from, or was certainly rephrasing something that political thinker David Hume said regarding the British government. He said, "We may give to this influence what name we please. We may call it by the invidious appellations of corruption and dependence, but some degree and some kind of it are inseparable from the very nature of the Constitution and necessary to the preservation of our mixed government." That's what Hamilton is paraphrasing. And what Hume and Hamilton are saying is that a certain amount of corruption kind of greases the wheels of politics. You can't avoid it. It's going to be there. It's practical, right? You can't erase all corruption, which is in line with a lot of Hamilton's constitutional thinking, right? At the Constitutional Convention. I've spoken about this at some point before. He didn't think men were angels. He assumed that people were going to do bad things for bad reasons, and the way to counter that was to create a strong system that channeled passions the right way. So he's assuming human nature is flawed. He's assuming corruption. He sees it as practical, and he's assuming that in one way or another, the political system can channel some of the damage from that. But he's basically saying, yes, some corruption, inevitable, not only that, practical and useful. And others saw this and commented on it. William Maclay, who I love, who's a senator from Pennsylvania who left the wonderful diary. There's one random quote from his diary that comments on this sort of corrupting of Congress phenomenon at the time. Maclay wrote in his diary, "This the important week and perhaps the important day when the question will be put on the assumption of state debts. I suspect this from the rendezvousing of the crew of the Hamilton galley. It seems all hands are piped to quarters." So there's Maclay saying, oh, all his guys in Congress, they're all in line, right? They're all ready to serve. Something's going on. Now, interestingly, when the Federalists were beginning to really lose power, the election of 1800 and thereafter, Hamilton said, and I'd sort of forgotten about this quote until I went back and reread my lecture from a million years ago. Hamilton said in 1802, trying to figure out what had gone wrong, what had the Federalists done wrong. He acknowledged that the Federalists had focused on influencing the wrong people. They had focused on the elite. They had tried to influence or shift, cultivate was the phrase he used, which again, influence might be corruption, it might not be corruption. Fluidity is the key in what we're talking about here today. But what he concludes in 1802 is, to win political victories in future, the Federalists will have to, quote, unite in corrupting public opinion. That's how he conceived of wooing the public. Federalists, many of them, felt like, oh, we shall be virtuous elite men, and everyone will support us because we are virtuous elite men, and we should never appeal to the public. That's demagoguery. And part of what Hamilton is saying in his Hamiltonian way in 1802 is, like, I still don't like the idea of appealing to the public. It's corrupting them in one way or another, but I guess maybe we have to. Now, that's one understanding of corruption. Another one is more in line with Andrew Jackson, so jumping ahead in time, and has to do, Jackson didn't see the birth of political machines. Certainly Tammany in New York is a political machine, a organization that puts certain people of certain politics in power, a political machine. The interesting thing about Jackson, partly political machines, but more significant, and this is what I was thinking about when I thought about him this morning, coattail politicking. Not new with Jackson, but because with the rise of Jackson in politics came the rise of a really more institutionalized, more networked, more organized form of politics in which parties aren't something to be avoided, but are actually wonderfully useful and allow people to network all over the place and help each other, help friends, put other friends into office. And coattail writing was, part of the coin of the realm. That's what you do. You get power and you bring in all your friends, and that's the way it goes. There are many ways in which we could look at that now and say, well, political machines and rampant coattail writing hardly seems like an upstanding and wonderful thing. And people at the time complained about it. People who didn't like Jackson complained about it. According to Jackson and his supporters, though, once again, they would say it's practical. When you look at, this has always fascinated me, when you look at the rise of what eventually become political parties, it's not as though people say, hey, you know what? Let's make a party. There's some scholarship that kind of hints that, older scholarship, and I'm always basically respond to that with an internal harumph. It's like, no, what people thought was, hey, if we organize this in this way, we can communicate more effectively with a broader sweep of people. Wouldn't that be great? And you can see, you know, Jefferson saying, how do I distribute this pamphlet to others who agree with me? I don't know how to do it. Why? Because there aren't apparatuses, what ultimately become party apparatuses in place that make it easy to do that. So parties were practical. There's a whole interesting, this is certainly the first time I've said, go see what Martin Van Buren wrote. He writes a really interesting defense of political parties, which shows you how far things go by the time you get to Jackson. But my larger point here is that you could easily point to grabbing all your friends and putting them in office, political machines of one sort or another, and say corruption, corruption. And you would be right. But particularly at this point, when a truly, well, not truly, I was going to say a truly democratic politics, a democratically organized politics is coming into play, you can see how people at the time were like, oh, okay, like this is what it means. Like you win and you win everything and you get to, you know, give out the riches. And then if you lose it. And that's the political game. Once small d democratic politicking is more accepted, widespread, assumed to be the way things work, you can begin to get a more complicated conversation about that. But again, we're seeing both Hamilton and in the world of Jackson, people essentially saying some degree of corruption is really useful. It's the way things are. It's how you run a government. It's how you decide who to give power to, right? It's not something that by their standards, you need to cut entirely out. And actually, probably Hamilton essentially said, you can't. There is no way to eliminate all corruption from government, which is not a reason for us to hang our heads and say, like, I'm surrendering government. But it is acknowledging, because of human nature, there will always be some corruption in government. Now, I looked, as I do, as one does, I dug around online to get a little bit more modern perspective on corruption. And one of the things that I found out more about, I've talked about it, I don't think here before, but I believe on my podcast before. Somebody just got bingo, I'm sure. I said the word podcast, is that reform in politics, particularly on a national level, but generally speaking, reform was never a sort of lightning bolt, like bing, it's better. It was always a very slow process, even when acts or laws were enacted to deal with the corruption problem. You enact a law and then you have to sort of see how it plays out and who's going to enforce it and then perfect it. So an example of this is the Pendleton Act of 1883, which created what we might now consider to be a merit system of appointing people for civil service, not the spoils system. That's the phrase I was looking for under Jackson. The spoils system, giving out the spoils to your friends and supporters when you take office. So civil servants get office ideally with the Pendleton Act in 1883 based on merit and not based on the spoil system. Now, obviously the act isn't passed and suddenly everyone says, oh, darn, no more spoil system. It takes a while. Apparently, initially, it really only affected a very small percentage of the federal civil service, didn't cover the states at all, but it continues to expand bit by bit in different ways over the following decades until by the start of World War II, roughly 90% of federal civilian employees of the civil government had civil service protections. The states had adopted their own laws. So there's a long drawn out process where people are saying, yeah, spoil system, not so good. Let's do something to work against the spoil system. And then maybe in a couple of decades, it will have gone into play. It shows you the degree to which, in some ways, to some people at some times, at what we consider to be corruption appears to be how things work. This is a problem. Now, how was corruption smacked at in these eras? How did you see the rise of legislation and attention being paid to corruption in the late 19th and early 20th century? Let me see if I have it here. There's an article that I found, if you're interested, from Harvard Law Today 2020. It's an interview with Professor Matthew Stevenson, and it's titled A History of Corruption in the United States. Apparently, Stevenson co-wrote a paper on corruption in the United States, beginning in the late 19th century. And so some of what I'm talking about here comes from that article, and particularly this, because Stevenson said that there were a number of ways in which corruption was at least suppressed some over time. And let's see, he has how many here? 2, 3, a number of reasons. First, he said the press. Interestingly, the press played a significant role. Number one, because of people who we now refer to as muckrakers, meaning journalists who were explicitly, deliberately exposing corruption of various sorts, even ultimately photographers doing the same thing, right? You had suddenly journalists deliberately raking up this muck to show people that it existed. And also regarding the press, because there were ever more numbers of newspapers and the price of newsprint was going down, and there was a lot of competition to get eyes looking at your newspaper. Covering corruption scandals were a great way to get people interested in your newspaper. So for purely pragmatic capitalistic reasons, it was another reason why corruption began to be exposed more. So those are not the only reasons why it rises, but they are a sign of something we've talked about before. I'm about to come back to it, which is the importance of the press in conferring accountability. I've talked about that 100 million times here on History Matters, but it's just another side of what I'm saying here about corruption, right? You in a democratic form of politics, the people give civil servants power, and the civil servants are accountable for how they use that power. And depending on the position and the person, and sort of whether the Constitution directly addresses them or not, power can be taken from them either through an election or through expulsion or something else, censorship, something. There are punishments that one can do of people who are, obviously corrupt, obviously violating rules. Now, interestingly, this brings us to today. I did not know before I began researching today that, and as I said at the outset, we hear a lot of talk now about ethics, about the ending of ethics committees or ethics organizations in government, about, enforcing ethics. Are ethics enforced? When there's a lot of talk about ethics, that means there's a lot of talk about corruption. They are two sides of the same thing, right? Two sides of the same coin. The word got to me eventually. Interestingly, the Department of Justice has an entire division focused on what they call public integrity offenses, which I think is fascinating. And it oversees the investigation and prosecution of all federal crimes affecting government integrity, including bribery of public officials, election crimes, and other related offenses. And when I was looking at this morning and I read that description, I thought, wow, they should be really busy, shouldn't they? Election crimes, related offenses. There's an election crimes branch within the public integrity section of the Justice Department. Anyway, this is not some abstract issue of morality and virtue that hovers above our heads. It's institutionalized in some ways. It's very practical. It's very important. It can profoundly shape what happens in government, whether we see it or not. But we have to be aware of the fact that there are many forms of corruption, and that just because people aren't responding to them doesn't mean that we shouldn't see them, highlight them, and question them. So, I tend to end our conversations, and I see I've gone a little bit over time here. I tend to end our weekly conversations by highlighting a number of things to consider now, based on what I've just said. So a number of them, I've mentioned them during my comments, but I'll reiterate this now. Number one is the importance of hearings and line drawing, whether or not there's a concrete, like this hearing has decided X and will do Y. The fact of a hearing, and ideally a public hearing, is really important in at least saying there seems to be a line here. We're looking at a line, even if only some people see the line. We need lines in politics, right? There are things that can be crossed, lines that can be crossed, beyond which it does not seem ethical, beyond which things appear to be corrupt. The other thing I'll mention, and this is one that it's important to think about because it's so easy not to think about it, and that is norms and the ways in which they have been collapsing or disappearing. And the more that, and you see this mentioned a lot by the press, things become normalized. What becomes normalized, if we just accept it and don't really notice it, are new norms, right? Bad norms, norms that involve corruption or violence. We're seeing in politics all the time ways in which different behaviors are now suddenly, for any number of reasons, sometimes it's the press, and I'm about to come right back to them, that seemingly normalizes something by not highlighting it and saying, this is not the way this is supposed to happen or how it has traditionally happened, and there are implications here. So norms and the collapse of norms are a big part of the story of corruption and what it's doing, the power it has. And then again, last but not least, the press. I do not mean to hammer at the press, because the press and a free press is at the core of a democratic politics, but I can't exaggerate the degree of its importance in accountability, holding people with power accountable, and revealing to the public, not just describing what's happening, but uncovering what's happening and what it means, right? Investigative journalism. This is a fine and important thing. The press isn't at fault for all of our problems, but there are some things happening in the press now by some aspects of the press that are not helping us in this situation. So I will very carefully there say, because I highly support our press, but as suggested with my comments about muckrakers, right, the press has an important role to play in addressing, exposing, and dealing with corruption in office. Okay. Oh, duh. Okay. I almost forgot everything. Okay. I'm sorry, guys. And I even had coffee today. Okay. So this is not the world's most creative mug, but it was the most obvious one. And I don't even need to explain it, really. Right?
Our old friend.
This is an old friend, but the old friend from a time when he was not the standard of corruption. He's a star, right?
Right.
He really used to be the sort of snidely, whiplash, evil guy of politics. And I used to lecture all the time saying, he's important. He's not just like the evil twin of Jefferson. Now he's something very different. But so this shows how far Hamilton has come. Okay. I don't know why.
Jefferson doesn't have a Tony Award, just saying.
It's true. Okay.
All right. Are you ready to dig into some questions?
Yes.
All right. The first one comes from our good friend, Richie Houston. It says, is part of Trump's appeal to his followers the fact that he challenges norms? Is that his, I tell it like it is, and is this the appeal of his change?
Right. Well, this is a problem, right? It's the swamp. I'm going to fight the swamp. And it's an eternal cry of outsiders. Right? Government is a swamp. It's all a swamp. And I, an outsider, I'm going to sweep in and end the swamp. No more swamp. Well, in part of what I said today is there's going to always be a little swampiness. Like, you can't eliminate all corruption from government, but yeah, that's the appeal of an outsider, or what part of the appeal of an outsider is, I'm not part of that mucky mess. I'm from outside. I'm not going to put up with any of that. So yeah, that's part of the appeal. I do think, and you're right, it's a two-sided thing. It's one thing for someone to say, I make my own standards and I decide what's right and wrong and I tell it like it is, and people say, yeah, that's what we want. And the other side of that is, I do what I want and say what I want, and I don't really care about consequences, and I'm not accountable, right? So that's a dangerous way to praise someone, and you really have to think about what it means, right? We're not very good at political subtleties at this point in time in American politics, but yes, traditionally Americans think outsiders are going to clean up corruption, and yes, traditionally, it's why military leaders have often become president, right? Military leaders are people, not only are they like manly men who fought in a war, but also they give orders, they tell things like they are, and that feels leaderly to Americans. So yeah, I think all of that is true, but I think the flip side of that is, what are the orders? What is this person claiming and doing? As I just tell it like it is and do what I want to do, right? If there is a leader, if there is a president who just does what he wants because he thinks it's right, consequences be damned, that's not someone working under a constitution, right? You're moving into authoritarian territory. Like, I am in charge. I will tell you what's right and wrong, and I will do it. And perhaps I might need to edit out part of the Constitution, but hey, I'm above it. Right, you can see slippery slope is an understatement, but some of the things which seemingly are appealing to many Americans are dangerous if unfiltered and allowed to free reign. I'll put it that way.
Yeah, I have to tell you, my friend Lawrence Schmidt is in here, and he joins us frequently, and he put something hilarious in the chat. He basically said, all the ones who claim they're there to join the swamp turn into the slimiest swamp man. I'm paraphrasing because it's scrolling too fast, but yeah. Anyway, he tickled everybody in the chat with that little swamp man comment. Now I'm thinking, Lawrence, we need to illustrate that as a comic book about DC. Okay, so this one comes from our friend Dave. Dave asked, presidents and governors have what appear to be unlimited pardon powers. However, I wonder if there was or is such a thing as a corrupt pardon that could somehow be null and void later. For example, a president pardoning people who were criminals, like Nixon's inner circle, and then were later found out to be. Can Nixon remain in office, or if Ford pardoned them, would those have been considered corrupt pardons, and should they be voided?
Well, pardons is a great example of the sort of gray area that I'm talking about. Yeah, there can be pardons and we've seen them. This isn't even recent, right? People being pardoned who many people think, wow, should that person not have been pardoned? Why are they being pardoned? What does it mean that they're being pardoned? It's sort of the opposite of the line drawing that I talked about with hearings, right? If hearings are important because they draw a line, pardons are saying, line schmine, right? There are no lines. You do what you want, and I'll say it's okay, and life is good. The power, particularly of the president, and I suppose you could, throw governors in here too, but executive power in one way or another is monitored partly for this reason, right? It's one of the benefits for the person in that position that they have some degree of personal power to do things like pass pardons. It's, again, why press and public exposure is important. It's possible, here we come to the rule of law. If there's a pardon and in some way it actually is either illegal or highly problematic in a way that bumps up against actual concrete issues of justice, that's important. And our legal system, the courts, the judicial system is important in part because people are going to use and misuse and abuse and seize power in all kinds of ways all the time. And that's one way in which you can pull the reins and pull people back. When people are talking about, well, the Supreme Court in particular, but generally speaking, all of the talk in again, recent and semi-recent years about how many justices or judges are being put on courts and how many appointments are being made by which president and what does that mean? That's vitally important because that shapes things like this, right? The judge you assign to a court, not just the Supreme Court, but just judges generally are making decisions on issues that clearly have moral and corrupt implications. We as Americans need to know and like to feel appropriately that we can turn to the judicial system and at least get something akin to a fair trial. And if we don't get a fair trial, we can protest that and then get a fair trial, right? It's vitally important that we know we have rights to stand up and use the judicial system to protest something that we think is corrupt, illegal, unfair, and have it be decided by a judge or a jury of our peers. That's another part of this. I'm basically, your questions so far are really good because they're showing how all of these things are interconnected, right? If you're talking about corruption, executive power, and pardons, and the rule of law, this network of accountability and responsibility, that's part of the core of our government. That's part of the core, or at least part of the core of the Constitution. There are many things, again, that are norms or extra constitutional, but still, it's important to think about the ways in which these things all interact and what it means if people are smacking at or ballooning one or another part of it. What does it mean? What are the implications? What are they trying to do? In the same way that I always say, if you respond emotionally to something someone says, pause for a moment and think, who is this person and what do they want me to think before the big emotional response? Same thing holds true here. If you see someone taking action against some institution of government, ask yourself why. Why would they be doing that? Maybe the answer is there's a big problem there, but you need to have, as they say in social media, the receipts, right? Proof of that. Maybe that institution or body is very inconvenient and needs to be pushed out of the way for people to get what they want. So my comments today on this topic, kind of like corruption itself, is about connections and networks and subtleties and the difficulty and importance of figuring out what's right, what's wrong, and how that line shifts. That was a very long statement.
Oh, that was great. All right, this one comes from our friend Susan Brewer. Susan asks, can you describe historical examples when norms were being assimilated or built? That is the buildup of corruption fighting norms. What reinforces that state of being?
Okay, let me make sure I got that straight. So is there an example of
historical examples when norms were being assimilated or built, the buildup of corruption of fighting norms? What reinforces the state of being?
I got to think of a specific example. Generally speaking, norms are what they are because they're seen as correct, useful, important, moral, whatever. There's a general agreement. I mean, you know, if you think about constitutional government in general, it's grounded on the fact that we as Americans share a general agreement that that is our governing pact. We interpret it really differently, but we're supposed to all be bound by that pact, right? That's why civil servants, you know, they have to swear to protect and uphold the Constitution. So I've totally lost where I was going. Norms, right? When do norms become norms? How do they become norms? I think that it's partly, you know, when I was working on my first book, I wrote about what I called the grammar of political combat. Looking back now, in a sense, what I was writing about were norms. And by that, I meant the things people assumed were right and wrong and possible and impossible in politics in the first 10 years of the government. There wasn't a moment when people said, you can't do that. You what do you mean you're having this kind of meeting with these kind of people to talk about these kinds of matters? Or wait, Hamilton is sitting in a congressional committee talking about legislation? that doesn't seem very right, does it? That seems wrong. There are moments when someone does something, it appears to be wrong. There's a protest or a comment or an investigation, and then something becomes seen as preferred or normal. So I can't say, kind of like what I said about reform, in the sense that reform isn't a lightning bolt, but it happens slowly over time. Norms become norms over time. I don't think that there's an instant normalization of something. And I think they're really norms when, strangely enough, we don't question them, right? It's kind of a counterintuitive way to think about it. I'm trying to think of another, what I can think of right now is a lot of examples of norms being violated. Norms being created is the question here. Right now, it's not popping into my head. I'm sure it will when we're done, but it's an excellent question. And I think the reason why, partly it's morning and I'm not a morning person, but also partly norms becoming norms is a gradual and not necessarily visible process, but I'll keep the back of my brain thinking about that.
And I apologize. There's a neighbor using some sort of loud machinery. Can y'all hear it? Is it distracting?
I couldn't hear it.
Okay. All right. So Bobby asked, so with the Rascals.
Hang on a sec. I want to come back to Bobby, but I want to quote what Timothy Johnson just wrote because it's useful. UNICEF, a social norm exists when individuals practice a behavior because they believe that others like them or in their community practice the behavior, descriptive norms, or because they believe that those who matter to them approve of them practicing the behavior. Now that is a useful definition. It's a social norm, and which may or may not be exactly the same as a political norm, but that's a very useful definition. Okay, back to Bobby.
Okay, so Bobby asked, with the rascals we have in politics today, were there rascals? And then she lists several. I'm trying, we try and stay kind of bipartisan here. She lists, I'm going to give two of the examples. She gave us a long list, but I'm going to try and she uses Marjorie Taylor Greene, George Santos. I won't list the others, but who were the rascals she's asking of early founders era?
Oh, we've always had rascals. I mean, it's kind of hard, I think, to think about actual real politics and no rascals. But they're different over time. Right now, what we're seeing with some people is they're being very, not just aggressive, but offensive, loudly and publicly to get attention, even though what they're saying is wrong. They know what they're saying is wrong. They have no evidence for what they're saying. They're just trying to garner attention. I tweeted about this yesterday because in a democratic politics, attention can easily translate into power, regardless of whether it's grounded on anything. So some of what we're seeing today is that, you can look at someone like poor Aaron Burr. Aaron Burr, I call him I don't know if I'd call him a rascal, but he was someone who was certainly an opportunist. And people knew that's what he was. And he didn't necessarily stick where people wanted him to be. He was unpredictable. I always, in my undergraduate classes, there's a graph that I once saw in an article that I draw on the board for them to show the problem of Aaron Burr. I have to sometime go and find that original article. I think it's from like the 1970s, but it's a XY graph. And on one side are the Federalists and their voting pattern, and on one side are the Jeffersonian Republicans and their voting pattern. And then there's Aaron Burr.
I'm sure Tim or someone will find a link for us momentarily. I really hope they do, because I would love to see that.
I think it's from the crunchy numbers era of political history. So that's the best I can give you right now.
Okay, this one comes from Jean, one of our longtime friends. So how do hearings with alternative motives, such as FBI whistleblowers, hearing that have been going on this week, people who lost their clearances or jobs, how does whistleblowing sort of fit into this, or ulterior motives like that?
Well, obviously whistleblowing is important, and people who want to be whistleblowers as this process is happening, that process needs to be protected, right? People need to be able to step forward and say something is wrong. Then you need to investigate what's happening, what they're saying, who they are, what they're saying is wrong, and is there proof, and all of the other things go along with that. But generally speaking, whistleblowing is a form of accountability, right? So it's important. The question about whistleblowing is what?
She was asking, what is your thoughts about the trade-off between that, you know, sometimes it's used like this week's example, she said, basically sort of like a witch hunt. When they use that idea that we're going to have these hearings, you know, some of them are to expose or reveal corruption, but then others are used more punitively. So she's asking some thoughts on that.
Well, I mean, you know, as I started out by saying, yeah, there's, I don't want to say swampy or murky, but there's a lot of amorphous area when we're talking about right and wrong and corruption. So it's entirely conceivable that someone can be a whistleblower for purely partisan reasons, without really very much evidence, and with a lot of support from one political side. And then it raises a firestorm of attention, suggesting that certain people are corrupt and pointing fingers at them. And obviously that's a partisan strategy that can be very powerful. But I don't think the response to that is to say no more whistleblowers. I think the response to that is, where's the proof? Where's the evidence? You know, in other words, if someone's going to be a whistleblower, they have to at least be able to come forward and explain why and what they've seen. Maybe the public can't see that evidence, but it has to be out there. There has to be something that they're using to substantiate that claim, and someone with political responsibility who is not simply acting for partisan reasons, at least, you know, which is why you have bipartisan committees, right? People need to be able to see what's being talked about and then work it out. It's when it comes, one of the things I'm feeling as we're having this discussion today is that when it comes to corruption and right and wrong, all of us want to be able to see, bang, it's wrong, right? Like we it's kind of like, is it pornography that someone said this about? Like you can't define it, but you know it when you see it, which, well, that is a whole different problem. But I feel like you can't necessarily always say this thing is wrong. And yet there are certain things when you see them and you're like, yeah, that's wrong. We want a clear line between right and wrong. I don't think there ever is any, and particularly in politics, but that's when information, receipts, the subtleties, the people, their background, motives, implications, networks that are leading to something. That's when all of these details, the things that historians love to reconstruct, but are really important politically, that's a moment when that all becomes important. Now, of course, based on what I just said, the counter to that is someone stands up and makes a claim as a whistleblower just to get attention, and then everybody jumps on that train and points fingers and yells, and that can have an impact. But this brings back to the other point about hearings. There has to be a follow through, or an insistence on evidence, or something that says, okay, you made that claim. If we take it seriously, then what? It's frustrating not to be able to have instant acknowledgement of wrong and right. But in politics, there's not a lot of instant anything.
Yeah. People have been referencing Watergate and January 6th in the chat.
Yeah,
and,
right.
Yeah. Okay, this one comes from Kathleen V, another one of our longtime friends here in our History Matters community. Kathleen asks, many people argue these days to defend current potential corrupt behavior and departure from norms by saying things like, oh, there's always been this kind of behavior. How is it perhaps different today, and what arguments would you make with this kind of thinking?
Okay, well, and people do that all the time with my book, right? Oh, well, you know, there's all kinds of violence. Things were bad before, and we survived. Now, of course, they conveniently missed the Civil War. But repeat for me the question. I'm sorry, Andy, I'm like so tired.
Okay, that's okay. Many people argue these days to defend current potential corrupt behavior and a departure from
and it's
norms.
always
There's
been.
always been this way, right? There's always been this kind of behavior.
The problem with that kind of statement is it's entirely devoid of historical context. So to go to look at, 1800 and say, ooh, there was a horrible thing happening in that election and it was corrupt. Okay, maybe, but in the context of the time, was it considered corrupt? What kind of corruption was it? How did people respond to it? You can't, it's very hard to equate one thing with another thing over the long stretch of American history. Historical context matters a lot. Now, that doesn't mean you can't look to the past for guidance on the present. You certainly can, but this happened before, so we're fine. Now it's just happening again. Assumes that two identical situations are happening, and they aren't. We've had messy times in the past, but our messy time is particular to our moment with our context and our variabilities, like the press and social media and everything else. Our current moment of crisis is our own. We can say there have been bad moments in the past, but they're not trans-historical. You can't say because this bad thing happened once, and it'll happen again and it'll be fine. That's wishful thinking, is what that is. Crises and corruption are not stamped out. They're born of a very particular moment in a very particular way.
Okay. This one comes from our friend Lois McMillan, who you met in Salt Lake when we had the live episode. She was on the teacher panel that followed our live episode that day. And she's an old friend of mine and Carolese. Lois asks about the New York Times article this morning on Senator Dianne Feinstein, talking about, is her staying in her role, refusing to entertain the discussion about leaving the Senate, is that tantamount to corruption? Like in the swamp and that sort of thing. Like, how would you categorize her not willing to leave her position, even though her ability to do her job has been called into question?
Personally, and when I was thinking about talking about the impact, democratic and otherwise, on tenure on broader things, that was one of the things I thought about, right? I thought about a Supreme Court justice. I thought about the fact that a senator doesn't have necessarily lifetime tenure during good behavior, but they assume, many of them, that they're going to be in office for a really long time. I don't know if I would call this corruption. I would say it shows a standard of assumption about people being in power and being given power and staying in power that needs to be questioned. Are the people who are saying she must stay in power, are they corrupt? Well, maybe they're worried about the power of their side in argument. That's kind of crassly practical, but is that corrupt? I don't know. So personally, I don't know if I call that corruption. I think it's problematic in all kinds of ways. But to me, it doesn't cross that line. But this is a great example where one of you guys out there might say, no, it's corruption, and have a great argument. And I suppose an argument could be made. I wouldn't make that argument.
Yeah. Okay. Lawrence Schmidt asks us, please speak about power and integrity of impeachment as a safeguard against corruption among public officials, especially in a highly politicized environment.
Right. So that was, go back to the founders, and they thought, and I've said this before, right? They didn't want an executive council running the government because with one man, if he, and at the time it would have been he, does something corrupt, the blame is all on him. And the idea of being impeached and having your reputation and character destroyed in that way would have been assumed to be a real detriment to being that kind of an irresponsible politician, right? Impeachment is supposed to carry a real onus, right? It's supposed to be a really horrible, horrible thing. Same thing with being censured. in Congress, right? In the olden days, certainly in a chunk of the 19th century, if someone was formally censured in Congress, they resigned their seat and went home. It was just like, that's basically a vote of no confidence. I've been, in a way, humiliated. I'm going to go back home. As I've said before, very often those people get reelected by vast margins because people who put them there are ticked off that they got removed. But I lost my way again, Annie. I missed a big chunk of my sleep last night.
We were talking about the hang on a second, I gotta go back to the question myself. Let me find it. I'll make sure I don't miss it.
Slightly better.
This was Lawrence's question, I think. It was asking about using impeachment as a safeguard against corruption among public officials, especially in such a highly politicized environment.
Yes. Dave, I need way more coffee. It's totally true. The problem, this gets back to norms. One of the problems with, with that idea of impeachment being an important way to stop corruption is we just saw 2 impeachments happen and nothing, basically. Right there, you see, in a way, frighteningly enough, the normalization to some degree of impeachment. I don't even know what to say about that, but that's a great example of something that would have been seen in the past as holy smoke, what a dishonor. It should never happen to, it's a president who was impeached twice. And he may be a candidate again. Yes, it doesn't matter so much. I know
we're over time, but we still have some really great questions, but I want to make sure since Amy's new to us, I want to make sure we give.
Yeah, I saw that she was worried that she posted it.
And I'm going to combine Dave's question with Amy's because they're both on the same topic. So Dave was asking if the CNN town hall this past week with President Trump, is that considered the press or is that aiding and abetting a cult? Amy asks a broader question, asking, could you talk a little bit about how the American press has changed since the 1790s as it relates to the reputations of political figures caught in corruptions? So basically, talk a little bit about the American press, how it's changed over time, and maybe how it got us to where we were this past week with the ruckus over, was that CNN town hall really news or?
Well, it's a huge question, so I'll tackle one part of it.
Okay.
Which is, in the 1790s and early part of the 19th century, newspapers might have claimed to be objective, but generally they weren't. They were partisan organs. They were paid for, often funded by politicians. You didn't read a newspaper assuming you were going to get unfettered, untainted truth. You just didn't. It wasn't on the so-called radar screen. Now, over time, at some point later in the 19th century, much later in the 19th century, you did begin to get norms about the press trying to be unbiased and trying to, really be investigative, and that in some way or another you could turn to the press to have truth exposed in some way. There has been a period when we assumed that was true of the press. The problem with the town hall is that by calling it a town hall, which it basically wasn't, and by airing it with a network basically saying, we're going to put our person here, it's going to be a town hall, so it's about the public. This is great. This is democratic politics. And CNN, banking on the fact that people would say, oh, it's a network, and we might say Fox is crazy, and someone else might say something on the left is crazy, but CNN in one way or another, for many people, would have been seen as leaning one way or another, but not crazily one way or another. So they were using the mask of objectivity, town hall, democratic, major news network, to mask something that, to me was just a highly partisan. And I wrote about this a little bit, about what a town hall meeting of this sort really is. One of the things that past town hall meetings did, and I can't say all of them, but many of them did, is that there would be an external polling agency that would find an audience of people that were undecided or balanced in some way, that you would have an audience that wasn't leaning one way or another, and that it would actually be an exchange of information. People could ask questions, the person could respond. This was framed and run in a different kind of a way. So to me, that didn't count as accountability. That counted as insincere framing. I got very angry that it was being called a town hall, because I don't think it was.
Okay, we
are way over.
We had more questions, and I wish, so guys, I'm sorry, we just never can. Some weeks we clear the deck. I try really hard, but this was such a hot topic that I think it would have been.
And it's a big topic, and I'm sorry that, first of all, I'm sorry that I couldn't address all of the questions. And secondly, my brain was fritzing out here. So the Joanne brain was like having a little couple short circuits here, even though I'm drinking coffee. But at any rate, despite all of that, I want to, as ever, thank you for beaming in here weekly with John and Annie and I, and for engaging in the conversation of democracy. What better way to engage in that conversation than by talking about corruption, what it is, why it's important that we notice it, how it can be covered up, and how it can be exposed, particularly at this moment in time, particularly when seemingly someone crosses a lot of lines and then doesn't get punished. What does that mean? What does it mean? So I think corruption, as I often say with isms, feels like this big, broad category, when what it boils down to is a person or people or a group of people acting in their own interest in a way that crosses the line of what's right, what is in line with a democratic mode of government. It's important to think about what corruption is, and it's important to notice when it's happening around you and not to allow it to be normalized. So thank you for engaging in this conversation about that really important point. We will be back next Friday with a different topic that I do not know. Someone yesterday on Twitter said, do you always make up the category, the topics the night before? I was like, I try not to.
Or sometimes you post them Wednesday, then you switch them.
I know, and then everyone's like, well, exactly.
We're fine with
at any rate, thank you all for being here. Thank you, Annie and John. Everyone have a safe week. I don't think I'm missing any holidays this week. I missed all kinds of holidays. I'm not missing any holidays, am I? No. Okay. And now what's going to happen is we are going to go rather late to the after party. What that means is that we will no longer be recording this conversation. If you beamed in here from the NCHE website link, just stay right where you are and poof, you will be in the after party. And during the after party, we can just speak more freely about whatever the heck it is we want to talk about. If you are watching on Facebook, you need to leave Facebook and join us at ncheteach.org/conversations. ncheteach.org/conversations, and then you too, poof, will be in the after party. Okay, everybody, have an excellent week, and let's poof our way into the after party.
All right, John.